Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Your time and presence are greatly appreciated. So we welcome you all today to the BSc Historical Criminology Winter Seminar Series, Meet the Authors. And the series is quite a flexible one. The series welcomes presentations from research in progress, research completed, and research published. So this ranges from PhD candidates to established academics and practitioners. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Lufuno Sadiki. Lufuno is currently a senior lecturer in criminology in the Department of Public Law at the University of Cape Town. She has over a decade's experience teaching criminology-related courses. She is an accomplished researcher and interested in decolonizing criminology as a discipline, as well as exploring innovative pedagogical approaches for teaching criminology at higher education. Her other research interests includes female crime, victimization, and the dynamics of risk and vulnerability among young adults. So today's presentation is titled Criminology in Africa, a Counter-European Rebirth, with a question mark at the end. So before we proceed, I'd like to do our usual code of conduct. So before we get started, I'd like to take the opportunity, in addition to welcoming you today, just to remind everyone of the need for self-awareness in how we treat this space. The aim is to establish a safe space for intellectual exchange. So please be mindful of this and treat each other with respect and dignity as a starting point for inclusivity. And as a note to participants, the aim is for these sessions to be interactive between speakers and audiences. So there's an opportunity to engage at the end of the talk, but however, Lufuno has indicated that potentially she might invite interaction throughout her presentation. So this is completely an interesting way, an interesting approach that we're taking today. So there are a number of ways in addition to waiting until the end of the talk. You're going to be invited to interact, as well as you can raise your hand during this time or write a question in the chat function, which has proved very useful for avoiding the sort of need to ad-lib questions, the nerve inducing element of that. You can place your question in the chat to avoid that. I also invite you to write where you're tuning in from in the chat, and also write your interest in the topic and in historical criminology in general. I like to get a sense of why people engage with this forum as we put together the future speakers and invite others to take part in the seminar series. So as I noted that the session is being recorded, so if you don't want your image captured, be aware of this, and you can participate from behind the anonymity wall. At this time, I will pass the floor over to Lufuno, who will take this away. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm just trying to share my my presentation. Can everybody see it?
I can definitely see it.
Okay. Let me just do that. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to such an important conversation. I'm always excited when I get invites to talk about criminology in Africa and, you know, the question of decolonization and whether is this counter-European rebirth. So thank you so much. And as I previously stated, I'm going to try to make it more engaging. I'm also going to ask questions just to be able to get a feel from the floor in terms of your thoughts about criminology, not just in Africa, but criminology broadly, and the question of decolonization and our roles and responsibility, not as educators, researchers, but also as students. So I'll try to make it engaging and as informal as possible. The reason why I always love talking about this is because I've found that in our own discipline, the discipline of criminology, that oftentimes we shy away from very difficult conversations, especially when we talk about colonialism, when we talk about hate crime, when we talk about what's currently happening in Gaza. We are very reluctant to engage with such critical questions. So I always welcome such an invitation. I'm going to start off by giving a brief history of criminology in South Africa, specifically shedding light into what happened in 2015. So in 2015, which was almost 21 years into democracy in our country, students at the University of Cape Town defaced the Cecil John Rhodes bronze statue, demanding that it be removed. And this act of deviance actually gave birth to what then we called the Rhodes Must Fall movement. And what was interesting was that they called for the removal of the statue, but it was not necessarily the physical statue that they were talking about, but basically they were talking about the removal of a curriculum that does not speak to them. It was a removal of a curriculum that does not acknowledge their history, a curriculum that does not speak to their context. So basically, the statue was seen as a symbol of colonialism and oppression, which basically ignited anti racism campaigns by the students who also called for Black liberation in colonial spaces, particularly in what was deemed historically white institutions. So in South Africa, we have institutions that were deemed historically white, which were more privileged institutions, and we have institutions that were deemed historically disadvantaged, or what we then call Black. So, in addition to questioning the presence of the monument, especially in a democratic country, the movement questioned the roads in our curriculum, which deliberately privileges Eurocentric voices. And this movement ignited debates about the hegemony of white male thoughts and the lack of diversity, not just in curriculum, but also in our institutions of higher learning. So basically, the students, particularly Black students, called for the decolonization of the curriculum to change to a more diverse staff cohort as well, but also heightened the need for broader institutional transformation. This then evolved into what we call the Fees Must Fall movement, which also highlighted broader issues of the financial exclusion of students from deprived backgrounds. And what was interesting with these movements is that it was not just confined to South Africa, it spread throughout, where globally students were asking, why is my curriculum white? And I think it's such an important question, especially for me, given that this year as a country, we are celebrating 30 years of democracy. And it's been almost 9 years. It's been 9 years since we had this movement, which ignited a recall to decolonize.
Wow.
And what's been interesting for me also is the fact that in my own discipline in our country, we hardly have these conversations about our curriculum, the colonial spaces that we find ourselves in, and the lack of transformation, where you find that our discipline in my country, it's still predominantly white males, white male professors who are still heads of department, who still, their books are the ones that are prescribed in the different modules. And even in our society of criminology, you find that they're the ones who are the leaders or the chairs or the president. So there's been a lack of transformation, and this sort of like, it's always, so I always find myself asking a lot of questions in terms of, what does criminology in Africa stand for? And how can we then revive, not just necessarily revive, but transform our discipline and bring decolonization? So debates about transformation and decolonization have primarily focused on the curriculum, institutional racism, as well as social justice. So it's basically been centered purely on the curriculum and racial inequalities in academia, with little attention given to structures of knowledge production, as well as gender inequality, which could often reproduce the same colonial practices that the agenda of decolonization aims to change. Transforming and decolonizing institutions and discipline, for me, are ultimately about power, whom it belongs to, whom it elevates, and who it places at the center of the discourse. So basically, for criminology, the question we should be asking is, who is producing knowledge? And whose knowledge is at the center of our curriculum? And how are marginalized groups? This could be women of color, this could be students, the LGBTQIA plus community. How are they positioned in the discipline? And this led me to try to sort of like my research aimed to sort of like answer this question that whose knowledge is at the center, but how are marginalized groups, including women, positioned in the discipline? And before I tell you about my aims and what I did with my study, I would just want to sort of like bring in a very prominent author who's been brave enough to question and challenge criminology, to say, to question the place of criminology in colonized settings, considering that it's a product shaped by Eurocentric philosophies on morality, law, and administration of justice. And the man himself is Agostino Biko. And he breaks with traditional definitions of criminology by emphasizing its oppressive and authoritarian characteristics. And then he calls it a technology designed for the control of others, basically a control freak discipline. And his views echo sentiments raised by Foucault about the utility of criminology, since the discipline itself is embedded in as well as reliant on Western justice system, and how offenders are supposed to be managed, without acknowledging how remnants of colonialism continue to influence crime and criminality. And for me, it begs the question because if you think about the development of criminology, not just in Europe, but everywhere else, in Europe, it was parallel with colonialism. And in South Africa, having been from a country where we have a history of apartheid, that is segregation, the discipline itself emerged during the 1930s when the then government in power enacted laws that sort of like criminalized Black people. And that's when the discipline itself emerged, and it was serving the interest of white people, trying to come up with laws that in essence were to criminalize Black people and in inverted commas to protect white people. So that led me to question the place of criminology in Africa, similar to the questions posed by Biko himself, to say if this is a hand tool of colonialism and it's a control freak discipline, what place does it have in Africa? And how then can it be decolonized in order to broadly deal with issues of crime and criminality, not just in South Africa, but in our continent? So this led me to my PhD study. So this work that I'm presenting today is from my PhD study that I completed in 2021. And for me, the aim of my study was to include or to explore African understanding of crime within the discipline, to sort of like try to see if we can discard the Eurocentric nature of the discipline by developing a more locally relevant approach within criminology. And to sort of like, in doing this, it was to see if the movement can be seen as a counter-European rebirth, which is a renewed focus on African sources of knowledge to not only understand crime and deviancy, but to also develop new approaches to crime and justice that are more responsive to the local needs and realities. So my paper will reflect on the status of criminology in Africa in relation to its counterpart, I'll provide findings in terms of the dissemination of knowledge, the curriculum taught, as well as explore female criminologists in the field, their experiences in the field of criminology in South Africa. So basically, the aim was to also explore how the curriculum continues to be redesigned to incorporate traditional ways of understanding, as well as addressing crime and criminality. So the study was actually 3 studies. The first study focused on dissemination of knowledge. The second study focused on the curriculum itself. And the last one, it focused on females' experiences within the discipline itself. So starting off with the first one, I wanted to explore the extent to which transformation took place in criminology by analyzing articles that were published in the journal called Acta Criminologica, which is the African Journal of Criminology and Victimology, which is actually the only Southern African journal dedicated to the discipline for the past 3 decades. So what I did is that I conducted a content analysis using a systematic sampling strategy with a 4-year interval. And the analysis included articles that were published between 1993 up to 2018. So what I did is that I analyzed the gender, the race and position of authors, the number of authors, the university affiliation. With the university affiliation, basically what I wanted to determine was, is the journal publishing articles from historically disadvantaged Black institutions or historically from disadvantaged white institutions? So from my findings, I realized that the hegemony of white men was still there. That is, majority of the publications were from white professors. However, there was an increase in publications from Black male authors. So there was some sort of like a noteworthy shift in terms of publication frequencies from Black scholars, with a significant increase in contributions from Black male academics. Although white males' presence in the journal was consistent throughout my analysis, Black females were making fewer and fewer contributions. And I say this with a disclaimer in terms of Black people. In South Africa, oftentimes we group together Black individuals, mixed race individuals, as well as Asian or Indian individuals in the same category as Black. So there was fewer and fewer contributions from minority groups or women of color. And the study, even though the study confronted the geopolitics of publishing, what became clear from the content analysis was the inequalities in the production as well as dissemination of knowledge, and this was greatly affected by the race and gender of the authors. And for me, ultimately, we can ask ourselves, so what if Black women are not publishing as much? But if you think about it, whose knowledge then becomes the center from which we view crime and criminality? In our classrooms, whose knowledge are we then disseminating? Whose knowledge are we then centering for students to understand the context, to understand crime within the context? So if it's fewer and fewer women, it means that then their knowledge is then not reaching the places that it's supposed to reach. So while women are making inroads in international journals as authors, the same could not be said for female criminologists or South African criminologists publishing in the ACTA. So this is especially so for Black, for Indian and mixed race women, further rendering them invincible as well as voiceless. My second study, which was on the curriculum, for me, what was interesting was that with this one, I did a survey, an online survey. And with the survey, it was sent to lecturers themselves, as well as postgraduate students. I wanted to explore to what extent African understandings of crime and criminality is being explored within the discipline. So I aimed to explore the curriculum content of criminology at South African universities to sort of determine to what extent African perspectives are reflected in the subject content, as well as teaching approaches, and to basically unpack both the views of lecturers as well as students with regards to decolonization. So an online survey was administered, and the first question I asked them was, have you heard about decolonization before? That was my first one. And majority said yes. And I asked them, did you hear about it before the Fees Must Fall movements, during the Fees Must Fall or Roads Must Fall movements, or after? And what was interesting is that majority of them knew about decolonization, especially the lecturers knew about decolonization even before the roads must fall, even before students started questioning, why is my curriculum white? And for me, that was very interesting because if we as lecturers know about these things and we're not doing anything about it, if we are aware of decolonization and the need to transform our curriculum, then why are we not doing anything about it? You know, and some of the questions that I want to pose to you guys that you can use the chat box to write is that, in what ways can decolonizing the curriculum help us to address historical injustices and promote a more inclusive learning environment? That's the first one. My second question would then be, what are the challenges as well as opportunities in integrating diverse cultural perspectives and knowledge systems into the curriculum? So the second question that I asked them was, what does decolonization entail? And these are some of the findings in terms of what it entails. And then at the bottom, you realize that there were discrepancies between rooting educational paradigms in the indigenous African epistemological frameworks, where majority, although they agreed, there were differences between Black scholars and what the white scholars said. Whereas the Black scholars agree that we need to then root educational paradigms in indigenous African epistemological frameworks, whereas the white educators or scholars disagreed. Also, I asked this question in terms of the content of criminology curriculum. And I first posed this question to the lecturers themselves to ask them, does your curriculum allow students to understand the origins of criminology in historical context? Do you include traditional methods of conflict resolution? Does it also inspire students to engage with issues such as discrimination, racism, inequality? And what was interesting was that a statistically significant difference with a median effect size featured between lecturers and students regarding the statement that criminology curriculum cultivates an appreciation for diverse entry points, with most lecturers saying that they do it frequently in their classrooms, whereas students say that, listen, this seldom happens. We are hardly given opportunities to widen the circles of contact or experience. And also we're hardly given diverse entry points around a particular subject. Furthermore, they said we're not taught about the traditional methods of conflict resolution. For me, which was surprising, because with regards to this, is that when we had the 1993 Rwanda genocide, the Rwandan government had to go back to traditional African methods of conflict resolution because most of the judges were killed, most of the lawyers were killed, prosecutors were killed during the genocide. They had to go back to African traditional methods of conflict resolution using what we call the Gatata court, where community members are part of the conflict resolution, where if someone has committed a crime, this individual is then brought to trial, but in the presence of community members where they hear the individual side of the story. And once they've heard each side of the story, they then find a punishment that fits the individual, but also then allows the individual to be reintegrated back into the community. In South Africa, we have what we call the Lekgotla. Whereas with the Lekgotla, it's similar in the sense that people come together under a tree and they come and discuss issues. And before the issue discussed, the aim is put on the table that as much as we are resolving this conflict, at the end of the day, we want the individual to be reintegrated back into the community. So it's said that as much as we have this rich information, we're not incorporating it into our curriculum. So the findings from the study indicated that there is a growing awareness of the need to transform and decolonize the curriculum. So this is also another interesting one because I asked the lecturers themselves that should criminology and its curriculum be decolonized? Some said yes, to a large extent. Some say to some extent, and some say not at all. And what I did is that I also asked them, should your modules, the stuff that you teach in your classroom, does it need to be decolonized? And more than half said, to some extent, yes, it needs to be decolonized. So there's that awareness of the need to transform and decolonize the curriculum in our institutions. So lastly, my study, the third one, I wanted to understand the positioning of women in the field of criminology by exploring how their race and gender intersect to create integrate experiences for female criminologists in the context of higher education in South Africa. Oftentimes, when we talk about decolonization and transformation, it's always about curriculum, it's always about institutional culture, racism, but hardly do we ever talk about gender. Oftentimes, gender is not even included, it's not considered important. So with my study, I wanted to bring gender into the center, move it away from the edges. I wanted to bring it into the center because oftentimes we neglect this aspect. So what I did is that I examined these dynamics so that we need to understand how race and gender interacts in order to be able to better promote inclusivity and diversity in our academic spaces, and to also work towards a more equitable and empowering environment for all scholars, particularly marginalized scholars. And in the discipline of criminology, feminist frameworks have been instrumental in understanding the status of women, gender, as well as criminality. And furthermore, feminist criminology has challenged the misrepresentation and exclusion of women in theory. Because oftentimes when we talk about feminist criminology, we're talking about white feminist criminology. So it's important to acknowledge the works that has been done to sort of like transform feminist criminology, to bring in color, because it has failed to account for the Black scholars and experiences of Black female criminologists. So with transformation as well as decolonization gaining momentum in South Africa, it was imperative for me to move gender from the margins of decolonization and to basically recenter it as a tool of transformation. So what I found is that with this study, I interviewed about 17 women white women as well as women of color who were holding different positions. Some were associate professors, some were full professors, some were senior lecturers, others were junior lecturers, just to find out how does race and gender interact to create experiences for them. And what I found from my study was that women's voices were still silenced and power appeared to be concentrated in the hands of men. While there's what we call a feminization of academia, whereas more women are present in academic landscapes, you find that male voices, their knowledge and theories still dominated. And using a feminist decoloniality, I highlighted how white male dominance and an old boys' school club contributed to the silencing of women's voices and the hoarding of resources as well as leadership positions. So the experiences of both Black and marginalized women in the study show that it's important for us to acknowledge how oftentimes women, especially Black women, experience what we call the double burden. That is the burden of being Black and also the burden of being a woman. So for Black women, it was a constant ism fight. That is for racism, sexism, as well as classism. And with some of the findings from this study made me realize that we still have a long way to go, especially in South Africa, because oftentimes when we talk about decolonization, when we talk about transformation, it's often for Black men. And some of my scholars, some of my participants were like, the fight is for Black men to now gain power, and that race was not necessarily a unifying, it was not a unifying force, especially for the Black woman. So the participants' experiences further reveal the need for decolonial as well as feminist approaches that seek to address the systematic power imbalances and hierarchies that exist within academia. So combined with gender, Black women were basically at the bottom of the social hierarchy. So in conclusion, the concept of the counter-European rebirth is basically a term that is used to describe a growing intellectual and academic movement in African universities that aims to challenge and counteract the dominance of European or Eurocentric epistemologies and knowledge systems in education, especially in the field of criminology. And I think what I love is that this movement can be centered if we deal with the race and gender issues, centering gender. This movement can revitalize the academic discipline in order for it to be more rooted in African perspectives, experiences, and indigenous knowledge. Much has been written on criminology's colonial remnants that continue to influence how the discipline itself not only interprets but also responds to crime and criminality. So for me, criminology and colonization has to do with criminalizing otherness that does not fit the Western mold and thus has to be changed, and if unsuccessful, oppressed. Oftentimes, crime and punishment was used as an extension of that colonial power. Even the Western criminal justice system model itself played an enormous role in legitimizing and maintaining that violent oppression of indigenous people. So for me, my study and my chapter, basically, I wanted us to move away. I wanted to advocate for a move away from the various criticism of Western criminology, but move towards an active engagement in theory building. And I believe an important component of theory development rests on the lived experiences of specific communities and should take into account the histories and identities of role players in traditional mechanism of jurisprudence. That is, we need a more inclusive approach within the discipline, where practices are informed by African perspectives and that we can no longer claim the Western sovereignty. That is, we do have African laws that can hold, traditions and customs. We can no longer say that, you know what, in Africa, laws are not written down. And that because it's not written down, then it means that it's not valid. In Africa, information is passed down in different ways. It not necessarily has to be written down in order for it to be considered to be accurate or to be knowledge. We have storytelling, we have music, we have African, the older generation, they hold that knowledge. So, locally and regionally, curriculum should be redesigned to incorporate traditional ways of understanding and addressing crime and criminality, and specifically so from African and other First Nation settings. So, I believe in Africa, we still have a lot of work to do. And I always say that decolonization is more of a personal journey, that it is important for us as well to also have an understanding of what decolonization means. Because I think oftentimes we mistake decolonization with Africanization or transformation. A lot of institutions are involved in cosmic changes where we'll bring in a bit of Black people, we'll bring in a bit of white, a bit of women, then we can say we are decolonized. And then you still find that power structures are still very much in balance. The status quo is still there. Then we can then not speak about decolonization because decolonization also requires deconstructing. You know, it requires rebuilding, and oftentimes institutions are reluctant to rebuild. They rather change the paint instead of rebuilding. So we still, I believe, especially considering that it's 30 years into democracy, we still have a long way to go. So that's where I end my talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that, Lufuno. That was very, very interesting, and so rich, such a sort of a varied set of themes that we can draw from. I think in I'm what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off the conversation by doing two things. Can I ask you? You asked the attendees a couple of questions at the beginning. Is there a way that you can cut and paste them in the chat? And also, there are some questions and comments in the chat that I think are a good starting point for you. So Andy introduced himself as a criminology candidate from Perth, Scotland, and says, I have a strong personal interest in history and have to keep trying not to go down the historical rabbit hole in my research. I think you should go down the rabbit hole, Andy. Kara Malloy has a comment and then a question. She says, I think one of the challenges of decolonizing includes the fear of not being able to adequately capture cultural and historical contexts of jurisdictions with which we're not familiar. We tend to stick with what we know for better or for worse. And then part of her question says, thanks so much for that fascinating talk. Kara, did you want to ask Lufuno your question? I feel like I'm taking up too much space here.
Yeah, no worries at all, Leslie. Thanks so much. Thank you, Lufuno, for a really fascinating and a really thought-provoking talk. I kind of just had a comment slash a question as well to build in. So the comment was that I was reading this really interesting paper by Louise Brangan recently, and it was kind of based on Ireland itself. So Ireland's that interesting case study that I suppose geographically we're located in that so-called global north, but at the same time we have this colonial past and colonial legacy there that has kind of parallels with the so-called global south. So her argument is that when we're looking at decolonization, again, that we don't just have this binary between North and South, that we also need to include these peripheries within the global North as well. And I'd just be really interested kind of in your thoughts on that, Lufuno. And kind of just the second part of that question again, that I was just thinking of is that I suppose, where do you see the future of criminology in Africa and within the next 10 years, kind of based on your own work and on your own research? Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for those questions. Thank you, thank you. Sure, that's very true. I think oftentimes we're so much aware of the global North and the global South. I mean, let's take Africa as an example, where historically we've got different cultures, we've got different communities, we've got different religions. And the question always that people ask is that if we are to decolonize, where do we even start? And for me, the talk about decolonization is not necessarily about making these divides between the global North and the global South. That defeats the purpose of the discussion on decolonization. But we need to be centered locally as well as regionally. You need to be able to ask yourself questions about, how does this fit into my local context or my local experience? You know, I think we need to start locally before we can even think about regionally and think about the global divides between North and South. It's important to be very central. You know, Ngungi, one of my favorite authors, he wrote the book Decolonizing the Mind. And he speaks about how with decolonization, it's about centering. Because oftentimes I'm also guilty of that rabbit hole where sometimes you end up engaged so much in what decolonization entails, what someone else is doing in the global North, what's happening in the global South, that you forget to recenter. And for me, I believe that decolonization itself, it's about recentering. So before we can even talk about the divide, it's important to recenter that knowledge, to see how does it fit locally? How does my experience or the student's experience? Because oftentimes the things that we teach, we expect our students to locate themselves in the US when you think about a specific theory. But centrally, how are they then centered? So with regards to where I see criminology in the next 10 years, if I'm being honest, I see it in the same place where we are right now, unless if people become more bold. The reason why I say this is that oftentimes we are engaged in a lot of workshops, in a lot of talks, where we talk about decolonization, we talk about transformation, but then we go back to our various institutions and we don't decolonize and we don't transform. And if I'm being honest, what I've always said with when I talk about these things, that oftentimes, especially in South Africa, decolonization has been seen as a topic that only Black people can speak about, that only Black people can share. And I think if we as South Africans can first dismantle that, where we see decolonization as a project, because if I'm being honest, it's not the Black person that needs to decolonize, it's probably the white male professors that need to decolonize. So firstly, it needs to be collaborative. It needs to be a collaborative project where both Black, white, mixed race, Asian individuals come together and partake in this sort of like partner to decolonize. Or else, even in 10 years' time, we're still going to be talking about the same thing. So I think that's my starting point, that if we can get those basics out of the way, then there's hope for us to really transform the discipline. And once we've transformed the discipline, then we're able to thoroughly answer the crime question. Because if you know, South Africa has a very high crime rate. I'm currently staying in one of the most beautiful cities in South Africa, which is in Cape Town. But the inequality between the rich and the poor is very, very wide. We have the highest inequality rates in the world. So we first, as criminologists, need to come together and partner in the decolonization project and also define it for ourselves and to define it for our discipline, that what does a decolonized criminology in Africa look like? If we can start there, then I think in the next 10 years, we would have made much progress. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Lufuna. So we had another of our attendees who both had to leave, but Isabel says, thank you so much for your important concepts and findings. Unfortunately, I have to run, but I appreciate you sharing your work with us. On the back of what you've said, I think that's so everything you've said is incredibly important. But more specifically, some of the questions that I explore with students is not simply what is decolonization, but also who needs to decolonize, why decolonization, what do we include in decolonization? And there is real danger of focusing on purely on race and then sort of turning the lens to the racialized. And then which on the surface of it might seem inclusive because we are in turning the lens, we're ostensibly giving a voice. But I think then if you really dig deep, what you realize is that we are sort of refracting the question. We are deflecting rather and saying, okay, decolonize, and we're asking for decolonization of those who themselves are the ones seeking greater decolonization. I came across this piece of research by a couple of feminist researchers that's consistent with what Kira mentioned about Louise's case study of Ireland, and it's the idea that concerns about decolonization in the context of post-colonial feminism, concerns about decolonization, and that binary divide between North and South should read as problematic, because and that the best way that we can overcome this is to have a more relational understanding of global North and South, the understanding that we can have South within North and North within South. So I think of the fact that you have Israel and Palestine, and one is considerably Southern and one is definitively Northern. And so the idea that the global North and South, that divide as initially or traditionally conceptualized, should be sort of uh, like I say, supplanted, and that we should think of South and North as everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So that as we think, for instance, of populations of people like Ireland, like Scotland, like Wales, or like Palestine, or also if we think of demographics of people in the metropole, like racialized peoples or post-colonial subjects who are racialized, but they live in the UK, for instance. How do we deal with those populations of people? And so, where do they fit within these concerns if we have those strict divides that say decolonization must necessarily be frameworked as North-South? Okay, so I had a comment about the gender element of your work, and I wanted to read it because I can go off on a tangent. So what you said about the double burden that Black women face in South Africa, it puts me in mind of Kimberly Crenshaw's concerns with intersectionality. The idea that we have these multiple marginalized features of identity, so race, gender, class, and we can list a whole bunch of others, sexuality, ability, etc. But starting with race and gender that intersect and overlap, and then create greater issues for those concerns. So, what role did intersectionality play in your research?
Thank you so much. It played a huge role. Firstly, when I did the interviews with the women, I had to also acknowledge my own positionality, that I'm coming in as a Black woman who is asking these questions. And intersectionality definitely played a role because these women were talking about how it's not just, I think there's a slide where I talk about it's a constant fight of racism, classism, as well as gender. And that oftentimes people don't realize the layers that are there when it comes to a person. where I'm not just a woman that's coming into class. I come with my different layers to the classroom. You know, I come and I stand in front of students. Oftentimes the students are white, they are male, and they already have a preconceived idea of who I am as a lecturer and what I'm going to teach them or not teach them. I think that the intersectionality really came through when it came to the interaction with the students. But surprisingly, for Black women, it also came through in the interactions with Black men, where majority of them felt that, okay, we are both Black. There should be some form of solidarity between us because we come from the same race. We might have similar struggles, similar background. But that's where the burden came through for them, where they realized that as much as I'm multi-layered, this Black man or Black scholar does not see me as his counterpart, where the race and even the gender puts them at a disadvantage. So those layers really came through for the Black women, especially also in the interactions with students, where a majority of them felt that they were, even before speaking in class, they were already misjudged based on the fact that they are women and also Black. But what was also interesting, because with this study, I not only interviewed marginalized groups, I also interviewed white women. And they also spoke about this intersectionality when they engaged with students, where one professor, she's an elderly professor, she was speaking about how I'm teaching crime and deviance. And each time I walk into a class, majority of the students are Black. And because they are Black, oftentimes they feel that certain subjects, I can't speak about this subject. Whereas someone else, a white participant, mentioned that sometimes she's often so aware of her race in the classroom, because oftentimes students are quick to say, but you don't understand. You are white, so you wouldn't understand. So it was very interesting when I analyzed those findings, just to see that intersectionality, that as women, we are multi-layered. That's why it can never be about gender and race, especially for Black women. They come with, we come with different layers, and those layers influence how we perceive ourselves, and it also influences how we engage with the academic landscape. I think for me, there are moments that make you realize that, oh my goodness, I'm Black. Every day you know you're Black. Every day you know, I know I'm Black. I know I'm a Black woman. I live in South Africa. But there's those specific intercrete experiences where, especially with students, where they question your abilities and they question you, and you ask yourself, if it was my male counterpart, would he be asked the same thing? There's a module that I shared with a white colleague, white male professor. And at the time, I had not yet achieved my PhD. And I realized that this intersectionality shines through a lot when I'm engaging with students, but also admin stuff. Because I was sharing a module with him, our admin lady was a white lady. And he asked her that, listen, please organize a venue. We've got a makeup test. So she organized. In the following semester, I had my own module, and I followed suit and I asked her, can you please organize a venue for me? And then she said, no, you have to do it yourself. But that's not the same thing she said to my colleague, you know. Sometimes when you walk into the classroom, students are very quick to judge, and then that you realize that, okay, I'm Black and I'm also a woman, and that might not sit well with certain students. So I definitely use the intersectionality because I think we are really multi-layered.
Thank you for that. I think it's interesting that you say I'm Black and I'm very aware of this Blackness. And I have similar experiences as a Black woman, also with Caribbean, with an accent that sometimes sounds very, very Caribbean, depending on how comfortable I am. And as a lecture proceeds, I become more and more relaxed, and my Jamaican accent really comes out. And so, it's interesting because I'll say this, that it has worked in both ways. It has worked to make me cooler to people, which I find to be very frightening because I'm not that cool. Whatever cool means for them, it means something completely different for me. But it also works to undermine sometimes that the content I deliver. So the examples I bring to the classroom are examples that I think are often not traditionally brought in, but also when they're brought in, they're presented in a particular way that I don't necessarily think enhances notions of inclusivity and equality in the way that we believe. So that this idea of the layers of discrimination that I think that a woman encounters is quite interesting. I'm interested to learn a little bit more about the discussion with your white female participants, because sometimes there's a risk there when we do research that includes history and decolonization, especially if we're focusing on race, that we tend to exclude the voices of people like our white colleagues, especially if we're saying that we want to give voice to the voiceless, we tend to assume that white colleagues already have a voice.
Yes.
So can you go into a little bit more detail about their experiences in the classroom with Black students and what they sort of like the benefits and the burdens of the whiteness
Yes.
for them?
I think that's what came out from the interviews where one who was a colleague spoke about that burdenness of being white, where oftentimes when she has to ask students to do something or an extra task, and they're quick to say, "You don't understand our background. You know, you don't understand." This came because when I did these interviews, it was during COVID,
Yeah.
and we were working remotely. And there was a lot of issues with students not having access to laptops, access to
Yeah.
Wi-Fi, because our country is it's a very unequal. As much as you find that you have students who are in these institutions that the fees are ridiculously high, majority of our students come from really underprivileged backgrounds, disadvantaged backgrounds, and they don't have the necessary means to successfully transition in institutions of higher learning. So one colleague was like, she was asking the students to submit an assignment, and the one student was like, "Ma'am, you don't understand my situation. I'm currently staying at home. I don't have access to Wi-Fi. At home, I'm expected to clean the house. I'm expected to cook. I'm expected to take care of my siblings." And for those students, they felt that because this lecturer is white, she doesn't sort of like sympathize with them or understand their situation. And the one colleague who's a professor was like, when she walks into classes, she's so much aware of her whiteness in the sense that majority of our students are Black. And she said something about how oftentimes she's scared to speak about crime because she has these male students who are looking at her. And oftentimes in South Africa, if you look at the racial distribution of the prison population, majority of our prison population is Black men. And she was talking about this contradiction that oftentimes, because she's also white, she's considered not to know much about the Black experiences or the Black history. And I must be honest, and I think you just said it so well in the sense that oftentimes when we have these studies, we always want to focus more on the Black participants. And I think going into this study, I was I was worried what type of information I'd get from the white scholars because some of the colleagues, when I asked them, some of the questions that I asked was, how has your race and gender influenced your experiences in academia? And one of them was like, have you ever been discriminated against based on either your race or your gender? And majority of the white participants were very, very honest and say, listen, based on my race, I've been super privileged. There was one lady who's been working in the same institution for 30 years. She's a white lecturer. And she said, in the 1980s, if I was a Black girl in that class, the opportunity that I got, I would not have gotten it. And right now it's important for me to acknowledge my white privilege, that based on the fact that I'm white and I was in that classroom, I was able to get a job. And similar to the white professor, she spoke about how there was a drive to promote women. And at the time, it was mostly white women. And that she was able to climb the ladder very quickly based on her race. So for me, it was just interesting how the participants were very open in terms of how their whiteness has been a privilege. Yes, it might be a burden in the classroom in terms of how it influences their interaction with students, but overall, it's for them it had been a privilege. And it was quite interesting for me to then compare that with the Black participants, especially the mixed race participants. In South Africa, we don't have the term mixed race. We use the term colored. And oftentimes there's this disjunction between the colored population and the Black population, where within the discourse, the one race is seen as superior than the other race. So it was interesting to see how some of the participants who were either Indian or colored, how they said, listen, I identify as Black, you know? And for me, it begged that question, that who then is Black? How then do we define a Black person? Because now I'm sitting with these participants, and this one professor, she's Indian, and she says, listen, as much as I'm Indian, I identify as Black. I thoroughly identify myself as a Black woman.
Why do you
And
think
it
that?
really, that was quite interesting for me.
So is this an instance of trying to gain access to privileges based on I guess in like my best point of reference is sort of affirmative action, which
Yes.
tends to be parsed out based on social factors like gender, race, class. Um, and so is that like an attempt to sort of fit in with a more privileged position, or potentially to capture the goods that are being disseminated based on these characteristics?
And that's a very interesting one, because I asked her the same question, that why and how do you identify as Black? And what she spoke about, she said that she was involved a lot in the struggle, where she would participate in protest action. And based on that, she felt that now with the new democratic dispensation, she's then an ally of Black people. She's part of Black people. She is a Black person, according to her. So for me, it was quite interesting, because I also thought the same thing, that is this, because as much as then we were majority but considered minority in terms of power, now a lot of opportunities are for Black people in the country. And that was my also first question, in terms of, is this you trying to, you know, gain access to privileges? But she says that because of her participation in the struggle, she felt that she was one with Black people.
But I find this to be very interesting, and certainly worth exploring beyond one person. You know what I mean? To sort of see the extent to which not just how you identify, but how you're recognized. So if you
Yes,
identify as Black, but how are you recognized when you
yes.
walk through the institution door, like when you interact with institutional actors, when you speak with students, how are you recognized? Kara,
Absolutely.
sorry, you have a question in the chat. Did you want to go ahead and ask?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a million, Leslie. And sorry, Lufuno, I'm asking this like completely for my own benefit because it's something that I'm struggling with at the moment. I really appreciate your thoughts on it. So, at the moment in Sheffield, I'm designing a new module next semester. So it's on historical criminology, but it's looking at kind of the Jack the Ripper case as that kind of, I suppose, basis to explore kind of historical time. But one of the prompts that we had to fill out for this module development form here in the University of Sheffield was that we had to incorporate kind of EDI principles into our module design. in, which I'm ashamed to admit was something I hadn't actually thought about before too much in relation to Jack the Ripper case before I started actually teaching that module. And it's been the best thing ever in terms of looking maybe, at how concerns over the Ripper reflected, the heart of British Empire and something that was very malign at the heart of that, and how I suppose that was interpreted in different colonies in the UK and India, for instance. The Ripper case was used as a basis and to kind of undermine the kind of national police force there. And there's just so many fascinating perspectives you can bring into this historical case study at the heart of an empire when we're looking at it through a decolonizing lens. But I suppose the problem that I'm trying to grapple with at the moment is how do we actually build in these decolonizing perspectives into teaching practice in a way that's actually meaningful, rather than, kind of at the moment, I feel like I have a separate 2 hour lecture slot on decolonizing perspectives on the Ripper, but it feels very abstract and it doesn't feel like I've connected those different elements of the module together. So I know it's a bit of a vague question, but I'd be really interested in your perspective, just from a teaching approach. How do we make sure that we ground decolonization within our modules from start to finish, rather than this kind of add decolonization and stir and kind of approach that often comes out?
Thank you so much, Kira, for such an important question. I think, don't worry, it's a question that we also grapple with in terms of decolonization. Because if we're being honest, we're not necessarily decolonizing, we're basically diversifying our reading list. Oftentimes, we add a reading from Biko Gozino, we add a reading from Lufuno, and then we say that we're decolonizing. And I think we're not necessarily decolonizing, we're actually diversifying. Practically, for me, to decolonize is to center knowledge, whereas we don't rely heavily on Western or Eurocentric voices, but for all the voices to be on the same standing. And for me, practically doing that is also incorporating student voices in my teaching. What I do, there's a module that I teach where I also teach Ontology and African criminology. And we look at the different theories within criminology and I critique them with the students. And I say, where do you come from, as an example? How is this theory applicable to where you come from? And I think that for me, that's been the first step, not shying away from critiquing the work that I teach. And I can say that, listen, as much as it's important to learn what Hershey said about criminology and what this one said about crime, how does this fit into your own personal context? And I think the most important thing is to always incorporate student voices. It should be a collaborative effort. And sometimes it's even changing. Decolonizing, it's not just necessarily changing our curriculum, adding this or removing this, but also changing how we teach practically. How then do I engage with the students in my classroom? Which voices am I amplifying? Does Rufuna feel comfortable to speak up? Does Karen feel comfortable to speak up in my class in terms of the subjects that we're teaching? It's including those student voices, but also transforming the manner in which we deliver our knowledge. And it's also trying to be more creative. What I also try to do, I bring in a lot of local context examples, be it whether I'm critiquing or I am explaining, because I want each individual voices to be recognized in my classroom. So also sometimes it's recognizing my own privilege. Sometimes I come into the classroom and say, listen, guys, we're teaching on this module, but just because I'm the lecturer, the educator, doesn't mean that I know it all. I invite the students on a more collaborative journey with me. Also, what has worked for me is incorporating issues that make people uncomfortable. I think in a lot of my classrooms, I want it to be a space where we respect each other, but we're able to talk about issues such as race, such as colonialism, discrimination. But the most important thing for me always, with whatever curriculum content that I add or remove, For me, I always address the genealogy of definitions as well as distinctions as a way to sort of like, as a critical approach that empowers students to decide or to engage in the work. And that has really helped me. But if we're being honest, even widening, as much as we might be scared to widen our reading list, it's also important to include different perspectives in our classroom. And that has worked for me. But the most important thing is to always question, is this locally relevant? Does this amplify marginalized voices? Is this representative? You know, is this, are students, will students be able to engage, but most importantly, will students be able to see themselves in this content? I hope I've been able to answer your question.
That is brilliant, Lufuno. Thank you. I've written all of those down and I will be incorporating those ideas. So I really appreciate your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for that. I think especially the part about student voices, I think as we're designing modules and we become more cognizant of the fact that our cohort of students will change from year to year. And so one of the things that I often get asked is, how do you refresh your module? How do you keep it relevant? And it's through student voices. So sort of giving students an opportunity to do like a poll on a case study that they find that comes to mind when you talk about a particular theoretical perspective, having them contribute, think about what case studies that off their own, not necessarily ones that you've offered them, but off their own that they might want you to integrate in the conversation so that they can perhaps get an understanding of how to critically assess some real life things that are close to them, close to their local community, close to their own lived experience, as you noted earlier about the importance of lived experiences. And it's interesting that, because I think it made me realize that this, at first I was a bit apprehensive, but then it made me realize that this is certainly one way of keeping the classroom into and keeping that living, active, flexible space that we know the classroom to be. Um, uh, so by year after year saying to students, I have this set of ideas, but I would welcome your suggestions for how we can take this from the abstract to the more specific, to things that matter to you more than so there was you asked a question in the chat. You said, how have colonial legacies shaped the content and perspectives included in our content in our curriculum? And I think that's such an interesting question, because first of all, isn't our curriculum normal? Isn't it perfectly fine? I thought it was perfectly fine. Like what are we talking about? It's interesting because it forces you it challenges what you already know as normal, and forces you to realize that there is this thing that we do. We have these singular ways of approaching explanations. And Kira said something earlier, then I mentioned the idea of plurality, the importance
Yeah.
of plurality. What do you think of that? Like the idea that for the orthodoxy, there's typically one way of talking about gender, talking about race, and talking about class. But you know that's a legacy that has held us back from being more doing what universalism and enlightenment said we were going to do, which is to universalize equality, right?
Mm, mm, mm.
So what's the role of plurality, like, do you think, to not simply to eliminate knowledge, but to sort of overcome the legacy of stasis that we see in the way that knowledge is deployed?
I think it's an important thing, and I think plurality goes hand in hand with multilingualism.
Mm,
When we speak about decolonization, transformation. And I think it's been such a huge debate in South Africa where we have 11 languages.
yeah.
And the question is always, official languages. And the question is always, then whose language is going to take center stage? Or whose view then is going to take center stage, because we've got so many cultures, we've got so many languages. And for me, it's not about taking center stage. For me, it's about being on equal par. To say that my view as a Black person is just as important as someone else's view. and that my voice is being heard. And I think in terms of pluralism as well as lingualism, it's more about those much. I feel like the first thing we need to do, and I think it brings me to the Black Lives Matter, where people start saying all lives matter. Yes,
Yeah,
all
it's
lives
true.
matter. That we know for a fact that all lives matter. But right now, as a Black person, my house is the one that's on fire.
Yeah.
As much as your house is important, my house is the one that's on fire. Can we focus on my house for now? So I think the first thing we need to do when we talk about pluralism and languages, the important thing is to first, those marginalized voices that are at the periphery should then be moved to the center. Only then, when we've moved them to the center, then can we find a balance and to sort of like deconstruct the power struggles as well as the status quo. But unless we do that, everything else will remain in the periphery, where gender, where issues of race, issues of languages, because I think the question that is always asked when it comes to decolonization, especially in Africa, it's always like, yeah, but some of the stuff is not written down. But yeah, but also there's just so much culture. Let's let's move everything away from the edges and bring it into the center. Once we've brought everything into the center, then we can have conversations in terms of how then do we move forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's interesting. And it's interesting when you mentioned the Rwandan example of the having no choice but to resort to tradition because of the elimination of the more sort of imported ideas. And I think also I did my PhD in Northern Ireland, and I came face to face with um I'm going to use alternate or non-traditional approaches to not just what we think of as criminal justice, but to equalization and to like social transformation in a context of in a post-context conflict where it had become crucial to find some footing for social stability. And the idea of restorative justice became front and center. And we know whenever we read the literature on restorative justice or we have conversations about restorative justice, one of the things that's emphasized is its non-traditional logics, like it's RJ as something that's non-traditional. So it sits not necessarily in opposition to what we think of as the traditional system, but it sits alongside the system to show the contrast and the potential. And it strikes me that you're right, that it's not necessarily about centering one thing, because it again, what we're doing, what we're thinking that decolonization is a pendulum that's swinging in to displace everything else, but really rather to actualize the equalization that the Enlightenment purported that we were going to have, which is, as far as I understood, when we say equalization, we mean giving people voices rather than deciding on a single set of ideas of what's right and wrong. So, you know, like there are often challenges to things like non-traditional approaches like restorative justice, where we say, well, it's not strong enough. But then you see it applied to something like Northern Ireland, and you see that it shows this great potential, and it effectively, I would say that it's a work in progress, but it's proven to be more successful than the traditional approaches. Yeah. So I think we're currently at 5:23. This is really lovely because there has been no struggle to find things to talk about today. I want to take the opportunity again to thank you very much for sharing your ideas with us, and they're fascinating. And just as I thought, it widens the conversation that sometimes we tend to hear in our singular sort of context, to show that there's a whole rich rich conversation happening beyond what we know and what we see and hear every day. So thank you very much for that. And thank you also, Kara, for your wonderful questions. As always, really greatly appreciated. we have one more presentation in the series. So on the 24th of April, we have Julian Molina presenting his ideas around criminology. And then we go to rest for the season until October, until the winter again. So enjoy the summer. All right. So I think I'll take the opportunity to say thank you again and give a round of applause if I can find the applause. Yes. Thank you very much. And I'm going to stop the recording.